Moving to Savannah was supposed to be a fresh start for me and Emily. After the divorce, I needed to get away from the city, from the memories, and find a place where we could rebuild. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quaint little suburb just outside the city, with tree-lined streets and white picket fences. It was the kind of place where neighbors smiled and waved, where kids played in the streets, and where you could almost forget the rest of the world existed. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a feeling. The air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. The birds seemed quieter here, and the nights were too still. The house, though beautiful, felt wrong. It was as if it had been waiting for us, and not in a welcoming way. Our first night in the house, I barely slept. Kept waking up, feeling like there was something just outside the window, watching. I told myself it was just the stress of the move, but deep down I knew it was more than that. It wasn't long before we met Mr. Jenkins. He lived next door in the house that always seemed to be in shadow, no matter how bright the sun was. He was an old man, probably in his late 70s, with a stooped posture and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sorrow. The first time I saw him, he was standing at the edge of his yard, just staring at our house. I gave him a friendly wave, but he didn't wave back. He just kept watching, his eyes narrowing, as if he was trying to figure something out. Over the next few days, I noticed him more and more, always lurking, always watching. It wasn't just me either. Emily started to have nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about a shadow man that stood outside her window. I tried to comfort her, told her it was just a bad dream. The fear in her eyes made me uneasy. One afternoon, while I was out mowing the lawn, Mr. Jenkins approached me. His sudden appearance made me jump. He was that quiet. He didn't say much, just stood there, looking at me with those cold, sad eyes. After an awkward silence, he finally spoke. "You need to keep an eye on your daughter," said, his voice gravelly and low. "This place isn't what it seems." "What do you mean?" I asked, but he just shook his head and started to walk away. "Just watch her," he muttered over his shoulder, "and keep her away from my house." That was it. No explanation, no friendly introduction, just a cryptic warning that left me feeling more unsettled than ever. From that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this neighborhood, and with Mr. Jenkins. As the days passed, I started to hear rumors from the other neighbors. They talked about Mr. Jenkins like he was some kind of ghost, a man who had lost everything and everyone he loved. His wife had died years ago, under mysterious circumstances, and his daughter had disappeared not long after. Some said she ran away, others whispered that something darker had happened. But no one really knew, and no one dared to ask him. The more I learned, the more I felt that we had made a terrible mistake moving here. The feeling of being watched grew stronger every night, and the shadows in the house seemed to move when I wasn't looking. Emily's nightmares got worse, and I started to have them too. Dreams of dark figures standing at the foot of my bed, their eyes glowing in the darkness. It was as if the house, the neighborhood, even the very air around us, was trying to tell me something. And whatever it wasn't good. Days turned into weeks, and Mr. Jenkins's warnings became more frequent and more disturbing. He would show up unexpectedly, always with the same grim expression, always muttering about danger. The man seemed more and more unhinged, as if the weight of whatever he was hiding was slowly crushing him. One evening, I was out on the porch, trying to unwind with a beer after another restless night. The sun had just set, and the shadows were creeping across the lawn. I spotted Mr. Jenkins standing at the edge of his yard again, just staring at our house. There was something off about the way he looked that night. His eyes were more wild, his movements more frantic. "Tom," he called out, his voice raspy and desperate, "you need to leave. Take your daughter and go. Now." I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a cryptic warning anymore. This was fear. Real, raw fear. But there was something else too. A kind of hopelessness that made my stomach turn. "I can't just leave," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's going on, Mr. Jenkins? What are you so afraid of?" His eyes darted around as if he expected something to jump out of the shadows. He took a few steps closer, lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "It's the house," he said, barely audible. "It's the shadows inside it. They've taken everything from me, and now they want your daughter." My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to believe he was just a crazy old man, that his mind was playing tricks on him, but something in his voice told me he was deadly serious. "What do you mean, they've taken everything?" I asked, my voice trembling. "My wife, my daughter, they're gone because of that house," he continued, his eyes wide with panic. "It feeds on fear, on pain. Once it gets a hold of you, it never lets go. I tried to protect them, but I failed. And now it's coming for Emily." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew there was something wrong with this place. The way the shadows moved, the way the air felt thick with dread, it wasn't normal. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, desperate for answers. "I tried," he whispered, his voice cracking, "but it wouldn't let me. Every time I packed up, something would stop me. An accident, a sickness, something. And now it's too late for me. But you still have a chance." I stood there, stunned, unable to respond. Mr. Jenkins's words echoed in my mind, filling me with a cold, creeping terror. Before I could say anything else, he turned and shuffled back to his house, leaving me standing alone in the gathering darkness. That night, the strange occurrences escalated. Started with the usual, the shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, the oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. But then, got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep when I heard it. Faint, whispering voice. It was coming from Emily's room. My heart pounded in my chest as I jumped out of bed and rushed down the hall. I flung open her door, half expecting to see, I don't know what. But the room was empty, just like always. Emily was sound asleep, but her face was twisted in fear, her lips moving as if she was talking to someone in her dreams. I leaned in closer, and that's when I heard it. The same words she had been saying over and over in her sleep for weeks now. "The Shadow Man is here." I felt a cold hand of fear grip my heart. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't protect her from something I couldn't see, couldn't fight. I stood there for what felt like hours, just watching her, afraid to leave her alone. Over the next few days, I tried to learn more about the neighborhood. I started talking to the neighbors, asking questions, but no one wanted to talk about Mr. Jenkins or his house. It was as if the entire street was under some unspoken rule. Don't mention the old man, don't mention the past. Finally, I found someone who was willing to talk. An elderly woman named Mrs. Carter, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years, agreed to meet me for coffee. She was reluctant at first, but when I told her about Emily's nightmares and Mr. Jenkins' warnings, she sighed and shook her head. "There are things about this place you don't understand," she began, her voice low and serious. "Things that people don't talk about because they're too afraid. Mr. Jenkins wasn't always like that. He was a good man, a family man. That house, it changed him." She went on to tell me about the other families who had lived in Mr. Jenkins' house over the years. Families who had experienced strange tragedies, unexplained disappearances, and sudden violent death. Every time, it was the same story. They would move in, and within a few months, something terrible would happen. "No one stays in that house for long," Mrs. Carter said, her eyes clouded with old fears. "And those who do, well, they're never the same. I don't know what's in that house, but it's not natural. And it's not something you can fight." Her words only added to the growing sense of dread that had taken hold of me. I felt trapped, cornered by something I didn't understand. And every time I looked at Emily, I saw the shadow looming over her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nights grew longer, and the shadows in the house seemed to stretch and twist with a life of their own. What started as fleeting shapes at the corners of my vision became something much more sinister. I could feel it. Presence in the house wasn't just watching us anymore. It was actively reaching out, testing the boundaries, trying to find a way in. It started with small things. Lights flickering, cold spots in the house that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But soon, it escalated. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut with no wind, and the whispering voices that had once been faint now seemed to follow me from room to room. Emily's nightmares became worse, more vivid. She started waking up with scratches on her arms and legs, and once with a deep bruise on her shoulder that she couldn't explain. Every time I asked her what happened, She would just shake her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's the Shadow Man," she would whisper, her voice trembling with fear. "He's coming for me, Dad." I felt powerless. No matter what I did, keeping the lights on, staying with her until she fell asleep. Even considering moving again, it didn't seem to make a difference. The entity was getting bolder, stronger, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. Desperate for answers, I sought out Mr. Jenkins again. This time, I was determined to get the full story, no matter how much it scared me. I knocked on his door one evening, and after a few tense moments, he opened it just a crack. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked even worse than before, like he hadn't slept in days. "I told you to leave," he muttered, his voice laced with exhaustion and something close to despair. "I can't," I said firmly, "not without knowing what we're dealing with. Please, Mr. Jenkins, you have to tell me what happened to your family." For a long time, he just stood there, staring at me through the narrow gap in the door. Finally, opened it wider and gestured for me to come in. The inside of his house was just as oppressive as I'd imagined. Dark, musty, with heavy curtains that blocked out all the light. The air was thick with dust, and it felt like the walls were closing in on me as I followed him to the living room. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. "I was a different man once," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had a wife, a beautiful daughter. We were happy. Until we moved here." He rubbed his hands together, his eyes distant, as if he were reliving the events in his mind. "At first, it was just little things. My daughter Lily started talking about a man in her room at night. She said he was made of shadows, that he whispered terrible things to her. I didn't believe her, thought it was just nightmares. But then, the bruises started, the scratches. She'd wake up screaming, and no matter what we did, it just got worse." His voice cracked, and I could see tears glistening in his eyes. "One night, I found her standing in the middle of her room, staring at the wall. She was different. Her eyes were empty, like something had taken her soul. I tried to snap her out of it, but she just kept repeating the same words. 'He's here, coming for us.'" Mr. Jenkins swallowed hard, his hands trembling. And then, she was gone. Just gone. No trace of her. No sign of a struggle. Police never found anything. My wife, she couldn't handle it. She blamed me, that I didn't protect Lily, that I didn't believe her. A few months later, she took her own life. I felt a sickening sense of dread as he finished his story. This wasn't just some ghost story or urban legend. This was real, and it had destroyed a family. Family just like mine. "Why didn't you leave?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I tried," he said, his voice hollow. "But the house, it wouldn't let me. Every time I tried to leave, something would happen. I'd get sick, or I'd have an accident. It was like the house had a hold on me, like it wanted me to stay, to suffer." He leaned in closer, his eyes burning with a mix of fear and desperation. "And now it's happening to you. It's chosen you and Emily. Feeds on fear, on pain, and it won't stop until it takes her, just like it took Lily." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The room seemed to grow darker, the shadows thicker, as if the entity knew we were talking about it. I realized then that there was no running from this. If I wanted to save Emily, I had to confront whatever this thing was, head on. "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mr. Jenkins looked down at his hands, expression grim. "There might be," said slowly, "but it's dangerous. Entity, it's been here a long time. Part of the house, part of this place. The only way to stop it is to weaken its hold. Face it, to show it that you're not afraid. That's easier said than done." I nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on my shoulders. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this thing take Emily. Not without a fight. As I left Mr. Jenkins' house that night, I could feel the eyes of the entity on me, watching, waiting. Shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and I knew that the final confrontation was coming. The question was, would I be strong enough to face it? The walk back to my house felt longer than usual, air thick with tension. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees seemed amplified, like the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. The shadows, once content to linger at the edges of my vision, now seemed to crowd closer, pressing in on me with a malevolent intent. It was as if the entity knew that I was coming for it, that I was no longer running. Inside, the house was eerily silent. Emily was asleep in her room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. I had to act now, before it was too late. I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing. I had no idea how to fight something I couldn't see, something that had already destroyed so many lives. But I had to try. Mr. Jenkins' words echoed in my mind. The only way to stop it is to weaken its hold, to face it, to show it that you're not afraid. I started to piece together a plan, knowing full well that it could be my last. I would have to confront the entity in the heart of its power, Mr. Jenkins' house. That's where it had started, and that's where it had to end. I couldn't let it have the upper hand, couldn't let it keep feeding on our fear. I had to draw it out, force it to show itself. I gathered what I could. Flashlight, crucifix I found in a drawer, and a box of matches. I didn't know if any of it would work, but I needed something to hold on to, something to make me feel like I had a chance. Before I left, I went to Emily's room. She was sleeping fitfully, her brow furrowed in fear. I knelt beside her bed, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "I'm going to fix this, Emily," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "Promise." As I stood up to leave, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" she murmured, her voice groggy with sleep. "I'm right here, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Go back to sleep." She nodded and closed her eyes, but just as I was about to turn away, she grabbed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let the shadow man get me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't," I promised, squeezing her hand. "I won't let him hurt you." With that, I kissed her forehead and quietly left the room, closing the door behind me. My heart was pounding, but I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let fear control me, couldn't let it keep me from protecting my daughter. The walk to Mr. Jenkins' house was like stepping into another world. The night was unnaturally dark, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach out for me. The house loomed ahead, its windows black and empty, like the eyes of a skull. I could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, the air around me thickening with malevolence. As I reached the front door, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. This was it. There was no turning back. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The inside of the house was even worse than I remembered. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. I could hear a low, guttural whispering, the same voice that had tormented me and Emily for weeks. It was everywhere, filling the air with its sinister intent. I made my way to the living room, floorboards creaking under my feet. The temperature dropped sharply as I entered, my breath visible in the cold air. The shadows here were thicker, almost solid, coiling around me like a snake. I could feel the entity's eyes on me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. I stood in the center of the room, clutching the crucifix in one hand, flashlight in the other. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. "You're not going to take my daughter." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the entity was mocking me. The shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness, and for a moment I thought I had made a terrible mistake. But I couldn't back down now. I had to see this through. I fumbled with the matches, my hands trembling, and struck one against the box. Flame flickered to life, casting a small circle of light in the darkness. I held it up, the light pushing back the shadows, just enough for me to see. In the flickering light, I saw them, Mr. Jenkins' wife and daughter, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes wide with fear. They were standing in the corner of the room, wrapped in the shadows, their bodies twisted and contorted as if in agony. "Help us," they whispered, their voices blending with the entity's, creating a chorus of despair. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This was the entity's doing, warping their memories, trapping their souls in this nightmare. It wanted to do the same to me, to Emily. "No," I shouted, raising the crucifix. "You can't have us. You're not real, you're just a shadow." The shadows recoiled, hissing like a cornered animal. The room shook, the walls creaking and groaning as the entity lashed out in anger. But I held my ground, forcing myself to stand firm. Flame flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, everything was still, air thick with tension. Then, the whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The entity was waiting, gathering its strength for one final attack. I could feel it, the weight of its hatred pressing down on me, the cold seeping into my bones. This was it, the moment of truth. If I failed now, there would be no escape. Not for me, and not for Emily. But I wasn't going to fail. I couldn't. "I'm not afraid of you," I repeated, my voice steady this time. "You have no power over us." The silence stretched on, oppressive and suffocating. Then, with a final, deafening roar, the shadows surged forward, enveloping me in darkness. I felt the entity's cold, slimy tendrils wrapping around me, trying to drag me down into the abyss. But I fought back, holding on to the crucifix, clinging to the light in my mind. I thought of Emily, her smile, her laughter, her innocence. I thought of everything I had to live for, everything I had to protect. The shadows tightened, squeezing the breath out of me, but I refused to let go. I focused on the light, on the warmth of love and hope, pushing back against the darkness with everything I had. And then, just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, pressure eased. The shadows began to recede, the darkness lifting like a fog burned away by the morning sun. The whispering faded, replaced by a distant, angry howl as the entity was forced back, its grip on the house weakening. The cold lifted and warmth began to seep back into the room. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, but I knew I had won. The entity was still there, still lurking in the shadows, but its power had been broken. For now, at least, we were safe. But I also knew this wasn't over. The entity would recover, would try again. It wasn't something that could be defeated in a single battle. It was a part of the house, part of this place. As long as we stayed here, it would keep coming for us. I had bought us time, but I knew what I had to do. We couldn't stay here. We had to leave this place behind, no matter what it took. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. The moment the sun broke over the horizon, I started packing. I moved quickly, throwing clothes, important documents, and anything else we might need into bags. I wasn't going to risk staying here another night. Emily woke up to the chaos, rubbing her eyes as she watched me frantically gather our things. "Daddy, what's happening?" she asked, her voice small and frightened. "We're leaving, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We're going to a new place, somewhere safe." She nodded, too tired and too scared to argue. I could see the toll that the past few weeks had taken on her. Her face was pale, her eyes dull with exhaustion. I felt a surge of anger at the entity that had done this to her, but I forced it down. There was no time for that now. We had to get out. As I finished packing, I called the realtor, telling them that we were leaving the house for good. I didn't bother explaining why. I just needed them to know that we wouldn't be coming back. After that, I loaded everything into the car, making sure Emily was buckled in safely. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The fear that had gripped me for weeks seemed to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. We were getting out. We were going to be free of this place, free of the shadows. But as I started the car, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it wouldn't start. My heart sank. The entity wasn't going to let us go so easily. "Stay in the car," I told Emily, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll be right back." She nodded, her eyes wide with fear as she clutched her teddy bear to her chest. I stepped out of the car, feeling the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on me. The air was thick with it, like the calm before a storm. I knew what I had to do. This wasn't going to end until I faced the entity one last time, on its terms. I turned back toward the house, feeling the shadows start to gather around me, the whispers starting up again. The entity was angry, desperate. So was I. I stepped back inside, the door slamming shut behind me. The house was dark, air cold and oppressive. The shadows were thicker than ever, writhing and twisting like living things, trying to drive me back. But I kept moving forward, toward the living room, where I knew it would be waiting. As I entered the room, the shadows surged, forming a dark, pulsating mass in the center. The whispering grew louder, the voices blending together in a cacophony of rage and despair. The entity was making its final stand, throwing everything it had at me. But I wasn't going to back down. I raised the crucifix, my hand shaking but steady. "You're not going to take us," I said, my voice strong and unwavering. "You're done. "You're finished." The entity shrieked, a sound so inhuman and filled with rage that it made my blood run cold. The shadows lashed out, trying to engulf me, to drag me down into the darkness. But I held firm, focusing on the light, on the love I had for Emily, on the life we could have if we could just break free of this place. The crucifix seemed to glow, faint light pushing back against the darkness. The entity screamed, the shadows recoiling as the light grew brighter. I could feel its hold on the house weakening, power slipping away. With one final, desperate effort, the entity surged forward, the shadows enveloping me completely. I felt its cold, slimy tendrils wrapping around my throat, trying to choke the life out of me. But I fought back, pushing against it with everything I had, the light from the crucifix blazing like a beacon in the darkness. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the shadows tightening around me, the light growing brighter and brighter. And then, with a final, ear-splitting shriek, the entity shattered, shadows exploding outward, and then evaporating into nothing. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the darkness lifted. The house was silent, the air warm again, the oppressive weight that had hung over us for so long gone. It was over. I stood up slowly, feeling the exhaustion hit me like a freight train. But there was no time to rest. I had to get Emily and get us out of here, once and for all. I stumbled out of the house, the sunlight blinding me after the darkness inside. Emily was waiting in the car, her face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with worry. As I approached, the car engine roared to life on its own, as if the entity's death freed everything it had been holding hostage. I climbed into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. Emily looked at me, her eyes filled with questions, but I just smiled, too exhausted to explain. "We're going, sweetheart," I said, starting the car and pulling out of the driveway. "We're free." As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. But the house was empty, the shadows gone. We didn't look back. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were far, far away from that cursed place. I found a small motel on the outskirts of a different town, and we checked in for the night. As we settled into the room, I felt the last remnants of fear begin to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary relief. Emily climbed into bed, and I tucked her in, sitting beside her until she drifted off to sleep. The nightmares were over, and for the first time in weeks, her face was peaceful, free of fear. I sat by the window, watching the stars as the night wore on, finally allowing myself to relax. We had survived, we had escaped the darkness, but I knew that the memory of that place, of the entity, would stay with me forever. It had taken so much from us, but it hadn't won. We were free. As I closed my eyes, I felt a tear slip down my cheek. Not of sadness, but of release. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we faced, we would face them together, far from the shadows that had haunted us. The darkness was behind us now, and we would never look back. I moved to the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, looking for a fresh start. The small suburban neighborhood, nestled between thick woods and winding roads, seemed perfect, quiet, serene, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. At least, that's what I told myself as I unpacked the last of the box. The first few nights were peaceful, almost too peaceful. The kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the silence itself was watching me. I chalked it up to getting used to the new place, but there was something else, a lingering unease that I couldn't shake. Then, I noticed him. Mr. Grayson lived next door, in the old, weathered house with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. He was an odd figure, tall, thin, with a hunched posture and a head of thin, white hair that seemed to glow under the streetlights. He had this way of staring, his pale blue eyes piercing through the dark as if he could see right through me. I'd catch him watching from his porch, never moving, just staring. I waved the first time I saw him, but he didn't respond. He just smiled, this slow, unsettling curl of the lips that made my skin crawl. It started with the noises. Every night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I'd hear them. At first, it was faint, like the creaking of old wood or the rustling of leaves. But soon it became more distinct. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, pacing back and forth, back and forth. They seemed to come from the direction of Mr. Grayson's house, but when I looked out the window, his place was dark, lifeless. One night, the noises grew louder. It sounded like something, or someone, was whispering just outside my window. I couldn't make out the words, just a low, sibilant hissing that made my heart race. I jumped out of bed, threw open the window, and stared into the night. But there was nothing, just the rustling trees and the empty street below. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress from the move, maybe. The fear gnawed at me, sinking its teeth deeper with each passing night. Then came the symbols. It was a Saturday morning when I found them. Strange, jagged markings carved into the tree in my backyard. At first I thought it was just random graffiti, maybe kids playing a prank. But as I traced the lines with my fingers, a cold shiver ran down my spine. They felt ancient, malicious, like they were meant to ward off something, or invite it in. I started seeing the symbols everywhere. On the side of my house, etched into the wood, in the dirt of my front yard, scratched into the earth. I even found one scrawled in what looked like dried blood on my doorstep. My hands trembled as I scrubbed it off. The sense of dread only grew. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong, horribly wrong, and I knew it had something to do with Mr. Grayson. The noises didn't stop. In fact, they got worse. Every night it was the same. Those damn footsteps, pacing outside my house. They started around midnight and would go on for hours. Sometimes they seemed to circle my house, like whatever was out there was hunting, waiting for the right moment to strike. But when I'd gather the courage to look out the window, there was never anyone there. Just shadows stretching across the lawn, twisting and shifting in ways that didn't seem natural. Then the whispers began to follow me inside. Started with faint murmurs, almost like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. They came from the walls, from the corners of the room, from just behind me. I'd whip around expecting to see someone or something, but I was always alone. My heart would pound in my chest, the sound so loud I was sure it would drown out the whispers. But it never did. They were always there, just out of reach, just beyond understanding. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd feel something watching me, breathing down my neck. And when I did manage to drift off, the nightmares were worse. I'd see Mr. Grayson standing at the foot of my bed, his smile stretching unnaturally wide, his eyes black and hollow. He'd just stand there, not moving, not speaking, just watching as I tried to scream, but no sound would come out. During the day, things weren't much better. I'd start seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, dark shapes slipping behind trees, darting around corners. When I'd turn to look, there'd be nothing. At work, I'd lose track of time, finding myself staring at the clock, hours having passed in what felt like minutes. My coworkers noticed too, asking if I was okay, if I was getting enough sleep. I'd just nod, offering weak excuses, but inside, I was unraveling. One night, things escalated. I was lying in bed, wide awake as usual, when I heard the sound of scratching at my window. My stomach dropped. It was a deliberate, slow scraping, like someone or something was clawing to get in. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle in my body screaming at me to stay still, to pretend I didn't hear it. But I couldn't. I had to know. I crept over to the window, my hands shaking as I reached for the curtain. The scratching stopped. For a moment, I stood there, frozen in the dark, the silence pressing in around me. Then, with a deep breath, I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing, just the empty street, the trees swaying in the night air. I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for being so paranoid. Then I saw it. Face, not reflected in the glass, but staring back at me from outside. Pale, almost ghostly, with eyes that were too large, too dark. The skin was stretched tight, the mouth hanging open as if in a silent scream. I stumbled back, tripping over myself as I fell to the floor, my heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. When I looked back, the face was gone, replaced by the dark, empty night. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening to me, what Mr. Grayson had done. My mind kept circling back to the stories I'd heard. The rumors about his involvement with the occult, dark rituals in the woods. I had to confront him. I spent the next day pacing my house, trying to psych myself up for what I had to do. By the time night fell, I was a bundle of nerves, but I knew I couldn't back down now. The whispers, the shadows, the scratching, they were all leading to something terrible, and if I didn't stop it now, I knew it would consume me. With trembling hands, I grabbed a flashlight and headed out into the dark. The night air was cold, biting at my skin as I crossed the lawn toward Mr. Grayson's house. The old, decrepit building loomed ahead of me, its windows dark, walls almost seeming to pulse with some unseen energy. As I reached the front door, I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. I had to know. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door creaked open on its own, revealing the dark interior. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell of decay, of something old and rotten. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped inside. The darkness inside Mr. Grayson's house was suffocating, thicker than any night I'd ever known. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of rot and something else, something metallic, like blood. My flashlight flickered as I stepped over the threshold, the beam struggling to penetrate the blackness. I called out, my voice trembling. "Mr. Grayson? Are you here?" No answer, only silence. I moved deeper into the house, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The hallway stretched out before me, narrow and lined with old photographs. Black and white images of people long dead, their eyes following me as I passed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed a door slightly ajar, faint light seeping through the crack. My heart pounded as I approached, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I nudged the door open with the flashlight, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. A table sat in the center, covered in a dark, tattered cloth. On top of it were strange objects, candles burned down to stubs, a knife with a blade stained dark, and a book, its cover worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The symbols on the cover matched the ones I'd found carved into the trees in my house, but it was the figure at the far end of the room that made my blood run cold. Mr. Grayson was standing there, his back to me, his shoulders hunched as he muttered something under his breath. His voice was low, rhythmic, like a chant. The room seemed to pulse with each word, the walls vibrating with a dark energy that set my teeth on edge. "Mr. Grayson," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But he didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge me at all. It was like he was in a trance, completely absorbed in whatever ritual he was performing. I took a step closer, the flashlight beam shaking as it moved across the room. That's when I saw it. A large, ornate mirror on the wall behind Mr. Grayson, its surface rippling like water. And reflected in the mirror wasn't just Mr. Grayson, but a dark figure standing behind him. A shadow, human-shaped but distorted, its form constantly shifting. The shadow in the mirror turned its head, and I realized with horror that it wasn't looking at Mr. Grayson, it was looking at me. Suddenly, Mr. Grayson's chanting stopped. He straightened, and for a moment there was silence, so complete and utter that it was deafening. Then, in one quick, unnatural motion, he spun around to face me. His eyes, those cold, pale blue eyes, were different now. They were darker, hollow, like two black holes that seemed to pull in all the light around them. His smile, that unsettling smile I'd seen so many times, was now twisted into something monstrous. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, voice no longer a whisper, something deeper, resonating from within him. "What have you done?" I demanded, though my voice betrayed my fear. Mr. Grayson stepped closer, the air around him seeming to warp and bend. "It's not about what I've done," he said, his tone almost amused. "It's about what's been done to you." I backed away, but my feet felt like they were stuck in quicksand. "What do you mean?" The shadow whispered, his smile widening, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. "It's been following you since the day you moved here. You see, I didn't choose you, John. It did." My stomach churned as his words sank in. What is it?" "It's ancient," Mr. Grayson said, his voice almost reverent. "Older than this town, older than time itself. Feeds on fear, on the darkness within us. And it's been using me to find new hosts to keep itself alive." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Hosts?" He nodded, horrible grin never leaving his face. "It's been waiting, John, watching you, and now, hungry." Before I could react, the shadow in the mirror surged forward, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. It poured out of the glass like black smoke, engulfing Mr. Grayson in a matter of seconds. His body convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the shadow consumed him, leaving nothing behind but that terrible smile etched into his face. And then it turned its attention to me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow was on me in an instant, wrapping itself around me, filling my lungs with icy darkness. My vision blurred, the world spinning out of control as the shadow invaded my mind, showing me visions, horrific images of death and despair, of the countless souls it had devoured over the centuries. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard Mr. Grayson's voice, echoing in my head. "You can't escape it, John. Part of you now." The shadow tightened its grip, and I felt myself slipping away, the darkness pulling me down into the abyss. But just before I lost consciousness, I saw something, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The shadow wasn't complete. It was missing something, a weakness, crack in the armor. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought back, pushing against the darkness, forcing it out of my mind, out of my body. The shadow resisted, but I could feel it weakening, retreating back to where it came from. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling with exhaustion. When I looked up, the room was empty. Mr. Grayson was gone, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The house was silent once more, the oppressive darkness lifted. But I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The shadow had retreated, but it wasn't defeated. It was still out there, waiting, watching, and it would come for me again. But now I was ready. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that the shadow was gone. But no matter how hard I tried to push the memories away, they clung to me like a dark fog, seeping into every corner of my mind. The silence in the neighborhood was different now. No longer peaceful, but oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark figure lurking just out of sight. There was nothing. No shadow, no whispers, no Mr. Grayson. Maybe it had all been in my head. Thought gnawed at me. Uneasy whisper that wouldn't leave me alone. What if I had imagined everything? What if the symbols, the noises, the shadow? What if it was all just a manifestation of my own mind, crumbling under the weight of stress and isolation? I tried to reason with myself. The scratches on the window, face in the glass, the suffocating darkness. I had felt those things, seen them with my own eye. But as the days turned into weeks, those memories started to blur, losing their edge, like a dream fading in the morning light. I started questioning everything. Why had I moved to this town in the first place? What was I running from? The answers felt distant, obscured by a thick haze that clouded my thoughts. I couldn't remember the last time I'd had a full night's sleep, or the last time I'd spoken to anyone outside of work. My life had become a series of blurred moments, disconnected and surreal. I even went back to Mr. Grayson's house, hoping to find some trace of what had happened, something to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. The house was empty. The door, once so menacing, now hung open on its hinges, revealing a space that was cold and lifeless. There were no signs of the ritual, no shattered mirror, no bloodstains, just dust and decay. Called out his name, but the only response was the echo of my own voice, bouncing off the bare walls. Was it all just a hallucination? A waking nightmare conjured by a mind teetering on the edge? I didn't know anymore. There was one thing I couldn't shake, the feeling that I was still being watched. No matter where I went, that sense of unease followed me, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. At work, I'd catch glimpses of something moving in the reflection of my computer screen, but when I looked, there was nothing there. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The worst part was the mirror. After what happened at Mr. Grayson's, I couldn't stand to look at myself in the mirror. Every time I did, I'd see something in the reflection that wasn't quite right. Flicker of movement in the background, a distortion in the glass, something just on the edge of perception. I told myself it was just my imagination. The shadow was gone. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. One night, I woke up to find the mirror in my bedroom covered in condensation, as if someone had been breathing on it. My heart pounded as I approached it, dreading what I might see. Slowly, I reached out and wiped the glass with my hand, clearing away the mist. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Just my reflection staring back at me, pale and gaunt, with dark circles under my eyes. But then I noticed it. Faint outline, barely visible, standing behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it, my mind racing. Was it real? Or was it just a trick of the light, a product of my frayed nerves and some sleepless nights? I wanted to turn around to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the gaze of that faint, looming shadow. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Just like that, the room was empty again. Mirror showing nothing but my own terrified face. I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling, my mind reeling. Was I losing my sanity? Or was the shadow still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike? I didn't know anymore. But one thing was certain. Fear hadn't left me. It was still there, a constant presence in the back of my mind, gnawing at me, feeding on my doubt and paranoia. I could feel it creeping closer, inch by inch, as if it was just biding its time. As I lay there, staring into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever truly be free. Or if I'd spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for the shadow to return. And in the silence of the night, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. Maybe it never really left. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed these chilling stories as much as I enjoyed sharing them with you. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel and give us a thumbs up to keep the terror coming. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring even more spine-tingling content your way. Before you go, don't forget to check out the video playing on the screen. It's packed with more unsettling tales and eerie experiences that you won't want to miss. If you have any frightening stories of your own or suggestions for future content, drop them in the comments below. Stay tuned for more haunting adventures. Until next time, sleep tight. You can.